Okay, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to another special edition of VLGA Connect, one of our live panel sessions on the topic of deliberative engagement practices in local government. As many of you are aware, the new Local Government Act for the first time embeds the requirement for councils to have deliberative engagement practices in their community engagement policy, and particularly for those major strategic pieces of work, the way in which you engage and consult with your community. And we're going to unpack what that means and the different ways you can go about that today with our special panel. Can I firstly pay our respects to the traditional owners of the lands from the various locations from which you all join us this afternoon, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Chris Eddy, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the VLGA this afternoon. The CEO of the VLGA, Catherine Arndt, will be joining us partway through the session today and will be part of the conversation. But let me first introduce our special guest speakers. Firstly, Kimbra White is with us. Kimbra is the director, hi Kimbra, and co-founder of MosaicLab. Many of you, like me, have worked with MosaicLab in the local government sector in recent years. Kimbra has a long history, even prior to MosaicLab, of working with and for local government, and is the co-founder, as I said, of MosaicLab since the early 2010s, I should say, and has had, is it 25, Kimbra, about 25 engagement sort of processes across the sector since that time.
Yeah, deliberations.
Yes, good word. Kimbra is also a former president and board member of IAP2 Australasia, and many of you would be familiar with the IAP2 framework. Joining Kimbra this afternoon is Brett Hennig, an author and activist who's with us live in the wee small hours in Budapest, Hungary. Hi, Brett. Thank you. Well, not so wee, but it is breakfast time there. Thank you very much for getting up and joining us today. Brett is the co-founder and director of the Sortition Foundation, which campaigns to institute the use of stratified random selection in government. Brett has a background in astrophysics, which has been really exercising my mind about how one goes from astrophysics to democratic processes, and he may share some of that with us during the conversation this afternoon. And welcome to you all. It's great to see so many councillors, CEOs, officers and people from outside the local government sector who are very interested in this topic today. We're expecting around 130 participants. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Kimbra, who's going to start with our presentation today on deliberative engagement practices in local government.
Thank you very much, Chris. I expect that the reason that most of you are here is today because the Local Government Act, as Chris said, requires that you have a community engagement policy that includes deliberative practices that can be applied to your community vision, your council plan, the asset plan and the financial plan. And I'm sure some of you are thinking, what on earth do deliberative practices mean? There are others of you, there are quite a number of councils that have been experimenting with deliberation now for the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And I think the question for them is about how do we embed these sorts of practices in the way that we make decisions in the council? And how do we do that in an environment where we've got really tight budgets? I'm going to just introduce ourselves first. So MosaicLab, we are community engagement advisors and facilitators, and we specialise in deliberation. We have, as we just said, designed and facilitated 25 deliberations over the last 5 to 6 years. Some of them you will know very well from the City of Melbourne, the 10-year financial plan, Future Melbourne, and you know that very difficult problem of the Queen Victoria market. We also facilitated the Future of Democracy in Geelong when the council was dismissed. But I think importantly for right now, we're working at the moment with Bayside and Glen Eira councils on their community visions and doing deliberations around that. And also with Greater Shepparton, with their council plan, we are putting deliberative elements into the work that that they are doing on the council plan. We're going to move to Brett to introduce the Sortition Foundation.
Sure, thanks, Kimbra. Yeah, the Sortition Foundation, thanks, Chris and everyone for the invitation. Sortition Foundation is a not-for-profit social enterprise. We want to support and promote deliberative mini-publics throughout the world. We're actually founded in Cambridge in the UK by myself, who's a Melburnian. But yes, I have moved to Budapest in Hungary, so there's a whole story there which I won't go into now. We are now also working in Australia though. Sonia Randhawa is our project officer in Melbourne, and we're working with Kimbra and MosaicLab on a few projects there. Our speciality is recruitment and stratified random selection for things like citizens' assemblies, policy juries, deliberative processes in general. We've done over 20 in the last couple of years of these things for governments big and small. So the UK House of Commons, a few select committees held a climate assembly and we recruited for that. We've also worked for the Scottish Parliament, for the Welsh Assembly, and many local councils in the UK on small projects as well, like how to rejuvenate their bus shelter in the city of Dudley, for example, how to reduce air pollution in the city of Cambridge. We're also supporting organisations around the world to do the stratified random selection for deliberative processes, organisations in Belgium, in Switzerland, in the US. So of course, deliberative engagement is happening in Australia and all around the world. There's a few famous examples, and I'm sure most of you have probably heard about the Irish Citizens' Assembly, but the Climate Convention in France has just finished 1 week ago as well, with 150 randomly selected people talking about how France can respond to climate change. The UK Climate Assembly I've already mentioned that we recruited for, many local councils, Victoria, also all around the world. And there's been such a surge in interest in deliberative engagement that the OECD has published a new report just this month, actually, Catching the Deliberative Way, where they document their what they think are the basic principles of good practice for deliberative processes. And they've also launched a database documenting the hundreds of examples from all over the world that is a good resource, an amazing resource to see what they think are the best practices and where it is happening around the world.
So we've just put in this slide about the absolute basic steps around what would be a traditional citizens' jury, citizens' assembly process. You'll see it starts with the council, a council decision as to whether they do this. Sortition, which is what Brett is going to talk about a little later. The fact that we have a citizens' assembly or a panel that deliberates. They come to judgment, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in a moment. And importantly, at the very end, you know, it's a council decision as to what, you know, a decision is made by council. Citizens' juries, which is the thing that you've probably heard the most about, is a very common form of deliberation, but it is not the only. It is not the only form of deliberation. And sometimes these have different names, people's panels, community panels, assemblies, but we're talking about this citizens' jury process. And you'll notice the Act doesn't say you should, you know, thou shalt implement a citizens' jury. It says you are to embed or use deliberative practices. It doesn't necessarily say that needs to be a citizens' jury. So what's important in implementing deliberative practices are these principles that are on the screen. I think they're the principles are very well known. As Brett said, there's been a version published in the OECD report. The New Democracy Foundation in Australia has had these in the public arena for a long time now. So any Googling, you will find these pretty fast. I want to talk through a few of them for you, because this is what we need to be paying attention to as we attempt to embed and put deliberation into our community engagement practice. The first is influential, and this is really important. This is about sharing decision-making with your community. This is about really making it meaningful and giving people influence. In doing this, what we are seeking to do is to implement the outcomes with an expectation that council would implement the outcomes of a deliberative process to the greatest extent possible. For those of you who know the IAP2 spectrum, that is really definitely collaborate on the spectrum. It's important though to remember that we are not taking decision-making power away from counsellors. Counsellors and the council will most of the ones I know, have maintained the final decision-making power. This is about getting better information for counsellors and the council in making the decisions that they make. The second one up here about deliberative. What makes something deliberative? So we mean by this that we have a group of people that considers information, weighs up options, and the really important part around deliberation is come to judgment. The problem with a lot of engagement that we see, the everyday engagement that we see in councils that you have to deal with, is that we end up with a wish list. And we know that we don't have the resources in councils to implement everything on wish lists. And we set up a set of expectations we can't meet. So the real benefit of something that is deliberative is it gets us beyond that wish list and to a point of judgment about a way to go forward. We get the community to prioritise so that you're not ending up with something that you just can't action. Representative on this list, Brett is going to talk about that in much more detail, so I'll leave that to him. Informative. This is another really good, important part of deliberation, because there's an expectation that we provide as councils to the deliberating group in-depth and balanced information so that the group can think about what are all of the constraints, the opportunities, what are the options before they come to some sort of set of recommendations. So really highly informed. And time. To do that, to consider a lot of information and to get to judgment does require that there is time, that you're going to have to allocate time. This second set of down the right-hand side, it's not a second set, we work with all 10 of these principles. So a clear remit, inclusive, blank page report, transparent, independent facilitation. I'm happy to talk through those in the Q&A. We want to leave a lot of time for you to be asking questions. And we have also, just hot off the press today, written a guide for Victorian councils about deliberation, and in this guide there is a lot of information about these principles. When I've stopped talking, I will put the link. This is free for you guys. I will put the link in the chat line so that you can get a copy of this report. This is the second thing I wanted to talk about before I hand to Brett, because we do have, deliberation and deliberative practices is a big step for some councils to take. And so they might be looking at how do we step into it without having to do the full citizens jury type process. Or they might, or a lot of you might, and not a lot of you, all of you are going to be having problems with budget. So we need to think about how do we do this in a really cost-effective way. And so we've put a lot of information into this guide around how do you scale deliberation up and down. So if I just give you a couple of examples about that. Time. A full-scale citizens jury takes, 4 to 6 days. Very typically they might be 5 and 6 days in length. And that's what we'd put at that high scale on the top of that diagram. At the medium scale, time might be 2 to 3 days in that more, cut down scale. And at a very low level, it might be that you run a standard engagement process, but add on a 1-day sense making workshop to it to give you that added deliberative practice into the process. Information's the same. In the full-on citizens jury, you would expect to have to provide to the deliberating group a lot of technical information, probably in a background report, You would have a set of curated speakers. Some of those speakers would be from council, some of those speakers would be experts in the field of the topic that you're deliberating on, and the panel themselves would choose speakers that they trust to hear from as well. So you're giving people a lot of information. If we're dropping down to the medium scale, you'd expect still that technical background report and a set of curated speakers, but you probably wouldn't have the time to have the panel select their own speakers. And if you're coming down to that very low scale, it might be that you're just providing a background report. So in the guide that we've written, we've looked at that scaling across all of those very important principles there on the left-hand side of the screen. And it might be that you can mix and match the elements that will fit your project and your timescale and your budget. What I think's important in the way we've done the diagram, how we've done it, is the more deliberative elements that you add in as you go up the scale, the more deliberative the process will become, the closer your community is coming to your decision making. So you see the community is coming in closer to be part of your decision making. And our view and belief is that as you do that, you are increasing trust with your organisation. So that's what I want to say about the principles and scaling, and I'm certainly happy to answer lots of questions. We want to go now to Brett, who's going to talk about recruitment.
So typically with these deliberative mini-publics that have been taking off around the world, the type of recruitment is technically called sortition, which just means random selection. It's just a technical word for random selection. And you may be thinking, why would you randomly select people to participate in such a process? And the main reasons are that it avoids any stacking or opening to your usual suspects. If you ever have an open participatory process, you'll see the same faces again and again. You'll see people who have access to grind, particular themes to push, etc. Whereas the random selection of participants typically avoids all of that. Of course, you may find one or two activists come into your random selection, which is hopefully sort of typical of your community and not overwhelming. The democratic legitimacy is the kind of second main reason, in the sense that everyone has a chance to receive these invitations. And I'll go through a bit about the process, our typical two-step process, in the next slide. But if you randomly select, say, households from the Australia Post database, then every household in your area has a chance of receiving that invitation and responding to that. And the second step is that you can bring together a representative sample of people. So you have a randomly selected representative sample of people. There's one example of the sort of invitation that we would typically send out in the UK. It looks very formal. It's saying, hey, how can we improve air quality in the Kingston Borough of London? And of course, it adds in a monetary incentive as well. So typically these things are done in a two-step process. So the first step is that you send out random invitations. In Australia and in the UK, this is typically done by post. There have been examples, for example, in France in the Climate Assembly, they did it by random telephone dialing. In the Irish Citizens Assembly, they actually sent people door to door, but that's a very resource intensive way of recruiting. And some people also have tried using open calls instead of a random selection of the first step, and we'll go through a bit of the pros and cons of that later. But our typical method is select, say, 10,000 households, print and deliver attractive invitation cards to those 10,000 households, offer them, say, a web address and a free phone number so that people can easily register their interest. Now, the response rate, of course, is often quite low. We typically find around 3%. Our best ever is around 7% for the UK Climate Assembly and some Scottish events. But it can also drop down to 2 and 1% if there are elements. Well, it's a struggle often. It depends on if the question is engaging. It depends on if there's monetary incentives involved. All these kind of issues and factors can affect the response rate. From those people that do respond though, and we typically find a bit of skewing in that first response, and I'll talk a bit more about that as well. So you'll typically find more educated people will respond, of course. Often you'll struggle to find younger people respond, people of lower socioeconomic status, etc. And so the second step is a stratified random selection to match your targets. So from the pool of people that respond, it's a second random selection, but it's done deliberately to correct that initial skewing in response rates. And often the targets that are set are demographic targets. So you want to have a certain percent of young people, 30 to 45, 45 to 60, 60 plus. There's socio-economic, such as housing tenure. And sometimes there's also attitudinal stratification depending on the topic. So if it's the Climate Assembly in the UK, we had a question about how worried are you about climate change. That actually increased the legitimacy to make sure that people who weren't worried were in the room. When we were talking about transport in Cambridge, we had a question about mode of transport, etc. Are you typically a car user, a bike user? Do you walk, etc. To make sure that all the different groups of people and the different types of modes of transport were used. So that's a typical two-step process. So this is what we kind of see. This is actually from the Assembly in Wales that we ran last year. So the first column in that chart is our targets, our census data. So gender, age, geographical region, and we had an education level as our sort of socio-economic proxy, if you will. The second column is the respondents. So you can see that we had a lot of respondents from the older people and quite a bit less from the younger people. There was some different response rates across geography, and this very typical higher response rate from the more educated people, of course. So the purple bit on the education level is university educated people, basically, and a very low response rate from the people with very few educational qualifications. So what the second step does is correct that skewing, essentially. It randomly selects people and makes sure that if a certain category gets full, then you can't be randomly selected from that category. This is all, we do this by computer algorithm. We've been working with people from Harvard University in the US to make sure that that second step random selection is as fair as possible. And what you then get, though, is you bring to the room a representative sample of people. And that is what gives it some of its legitimacy. If people see a photo of that room or walk into that room, it looks like your community. It looks like the area that you're from on these important dimensions, of course. Sometimes we include disability questions, ethnicity questions, language questions. All this is possible. So recruiting it's a really hard part of the process. Of course, the deliberative processes are really important, but actually getting those people into the room is often quite a challenge. So what you can do is the two basic options at the start are either to have an open call. You say, hey, anyone can register their interest in this event, or you can have a random selection. So you deliver 10,000 invitations to randomly selected households. The sort of gold standard is the second version, to randomly select houses. But there are various reasons why you might go for an open call. Perhaps the principal one is cost. If you just put the call out in your council newsletter, you put some flyers up, you put an ad in the paper, pay for some Facebook advertising, etc., then that's relatively cheap with respect to printing and delivering 10,000 invitations or more. What we have started seeing happening in the UK and potentially in Victoria as well is to actually start growing a pool of community deliberators. So instead of doing this recruitment process every time you have to have a deliberative mini public or a deliberative engagement practice, you top up your pool. So you do it once, maybe on a large scale, you get a certain amount of people who reply, who are interested in being part of these deliberative processes. And each year you send out a smaller version of this invitation to maybe 1,000 households. And you just keep topping up and topping up. And so in the future, recruitment would be very easy. You would just have the pool there. And for a bit of an upfront cost, you could then save substantial money in the future just by growing this pool of community deliberators. Then that would mean your various options for your deliberative engagement processes. You have more options. I mean, one could be that you select one panel, and that panel deliberates on all the various topics that you need to deliberate on. There are various benefits there in the sense that they will build capacity and knowledge about how council works and the trade-offs involved in any council decisions. They'll become good deliberators in a sense and used to the process, and you won't have to go through that process again and again. There is also some cons, of course. If you're asking one group of people to deliberate again and again and again, you could expect a bit of attrition, a few people dropping out, etc., and what to do there. The other would be to have one panel for each topic. So that means you have more, you potentially need more time. But again, you're involving more people in your community. But again, the numbers are quite small. Typically, these sort of mini publics at a council level can be 30, 40, 50 people. So even if you're having either one group or if you're having 4 groups, it's not so many people in the whole council, because the point is that they deliberate sort of on behalf of everyone else. They go through, it's a bit like a jury, of course. They go through the processes that any group of that demographically representative group would go through. And what we're also seeing is various places around the world are starting to move towards standing community assemblies. So this would mean that you basically have a group of people that potentially meet, say, one weekend a month, every month, and you would rotate through those people every year. So maybe every 6 months you would replace half of them. And this is sort of like, these people would know that they're going to deliberate on a council issue on the 3rd weekend of every month. And you could use these for to satisfy the requirements of the Act, but you could also use them for any controversial local issue. If there's a region to be developed and there's lots of controversy, you could say, well, let's find out what a demographically representative sample in an informed environment think of that. And it gives you legitimacy in the decision making, and it sort of opens up also that political space for change. If you're finding there's lots of various interests pulling in different ways, you can say, well, what would a representative sample of people in an informed deliberative environment actually think? So as these processes grow, and as you grow, if you do grow a pool of community deliberators, of course, you could start off doing one panel for everything, or one panel for each subject, but with this in mind that potentially it could become a standing community assembly in a sense.
Yes, so this is just the last slide. So if I've just put in the chat line a link to our website where you can just download the free resource, that guide. We are also putting together a guide with the Sortition Foundation around recruiting deliberative panels. That's yet to be completed, but please, there's a lot of information on both our websites, so please feel welcome to go there. And I think we are over to questions, Chris.
Thank you, Kimbra, and thank you, Brett. Yes, we can see everyone on the screen now and move into Q&A time. We do have a queue, actually, of people who want to ask questions, and thank you for using the chat window to flag your questions. Please continue to do that. Now, if you've done that, I'm going to call on you, and hopefully you've got your camera and you can unmute yourself and firstly give you the option to ask the question yourself. So Ellen Davis-Meehan has a question about defining deliberative engagement. Ellen, are you there?
Yes, hello. This is something that I'm across how you've presented it, and there's a lot of us who are practitioners who assume, yes, this is what deliberative engagement is, but when you're selling it to a broader council, the range of definitions can vary. And I have been in a meeting this week with on a legal briefing on the Act, where I talked about the sorts of deliberative processes here, and they said, well, you know, maybe not quite, as long as it's deep engagement. And I'm going, well, what does deep engagement mean? So I'm looking for a really clear definition of this is what deliberative engagement is. Sure, we'll have to unpack it to say, well, this might there's variations within that, and this might be what it means for our council. And I really liked your various levels of deliberation. I'll find that very useful, thank you. But is there an accepted definition that in our community engagement policy we could go, here it is, this is what our guidelines are based on?
Well, I'll start first. Brett might have the academic view of this. We've put a definition into the guide that we've been using, which is that, deliberation by itself is a long and careful consideration or discussion. Public deliberation, when used with the word democracy, describes a group of everyday people considering relevant facts, multiple points of view, identifying options and coming to a group decision. So, I think for us, it's a really good question, and there are lots of definitions out, there probably are multiple definitions. We've been trying to go for something quite simple, but keeping really focused on the principles, like the Act has a set of principles for community engagement, and for, it's a principles-based Act. So I think it's really important we keep our mind on the principles of deliberation. And I think principles of deliberation are really well accepted, and that just saying it's deeper isn't very useful for us. We really need to know what that means. So I really agree with you that we need to be clear about what this means. Brett has a more international view of this, so I don't know if Brett's got a very commonly accepted definition.
You can look at the deliberative, the theory of deliberative processes, etc. But I think they're embodied precisely by your principles, Kimbra. Reason giving in an informed setting by a representative sample of people. I think if you can tick off most of those principles, then you're definitely satisfying this definition of deliberation.
Yes, because I guess, Kimbra, the question too is if a council's policy was to be questioned in terms of whether it complies with the Act, by what measure are those deliberative engagements going to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, it seems like it's got to be, it's just these principles. You've got to have lots of time. There's got to be an informed setting. It's got to be, it's just back to the principles, I think. But yeah, if that got challenged legally.
Yeah, well, I'm not suggesting it's going to happen. Yes, Kimbra?
Oh, I was just going to say, it's the same way we judge good quality engagement. Whenever we are judging, is this good engagement, we go back to the core values of IEP2, and they are very similar to the principles that have been put in the Act. So I think it's quite common to use principles or core values as the way of making judgment. And you would see that in the VAGO, in the Auditor General's work about engagement as well.
Great question. Thank you, Alan. Nicola Wass, are you with us, Nicola? A question around this coming to judgment as opposed to coming to consensus. Nicola?
Yes, I am, and apologies, my camera is not on and it's not functioning today. Hi, Kimbra. I noticed that you said coming to judgment, you didn't say coming to consensus, and certainly when I've facilitated deliberative processes, that's sort of where we've landed. We've done a lot of work under the new democracy model, which says an 80% consensus, a supermajority at 80%, or, you invite the participants to identify their own accepted level. So can you just talk a little bit about why you're saying coming to judgment rather than coming to consensus?
I'm using coming to judgment in the sense of comparing it to a wish list. A lot of standard engagement, you end up with a very big, long list of what the community wants. And we know that that's really hard to deliver on and creates expectations that are hard to deliver on. So in terms of coming in a deliberative process, we're saying we want to get people to that next step beyond the wish list to a judgment, that they come to a set of recommendations. Now, we do seek, when we're facilitating like you, we are seeking to get to consensus. And there are we've got lots of examples where a panel or a jury have managed to come to consensus, 100% agreement on a particular recommendation that, as Nicola was just talking about, we can't always achieve that. So we go to that 80% supermajority. We certainly never work with a 51% majority because, as we know, with things like Brexit, it just creates a lot of very dissatisfied people. So that supermajority is quite hard, but I'm using judgment in that other sense of we're expecting a deliberation group to come to a set of recommendations, and we have a number of processes like you about how we get them there.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Kimbra.
Thank you, Nicola. Thanks for the question. Now, Gay has posed a couple of questions. I'm going to give you the chance to ask one of those, Gay, while we move through our list of questions. So your choice on which one's the most burning one for you?
Look, I'm actually really interested in how we recruit. I mean, I know the presentation did cover this issue, but there is considerable effort needed to recruit the right people, a representative sample for a deliberative process. And I'm just wondering how you do that effectively while maintaining, you know, some cost control around it, because we know it has to be a robust process, but how do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gay, of course. And that's the whole debate between open or random recruitment. So if you are, we typically do like a factor of 200. If we wanted to recruit, say, 30 people to an assembly, we would send out 200 times that invitations. So typically, say, 6,000 invitations. Printing delivery of invitation packages can be, I don't know, $1 or $2 each. So that's, you're looking at, say, $10,000 to send out the first invitation package. The actual, and then setting up a registration process and then doing the second step random selection. I mean, this is what we specialize in and we try to offer, of course, as low cost as we can. We're a not-for-profit organization. But it's all, that's the challenge. And if you don't have the funds to do that sort of random selection step, then yeah, the cheaper way is, as I was mentioning, just to put a call out in your council newsletter, to put a call out on your website, in your Facebook, etc., and try to get the numbers through an open process. There's just also issues with that. Although it can be cheaper, of course, various groups can mobilize to register all their members, etc., and therefore, instead of getting you'll skew it more towards the usual suspects than you would through a random process. But trying to keep those costs down, it's a great question. I mean, our process that we use for the second step is a computer program which we've open sourced. We're happy to train councils up in how to use that very cheaply. We're happy to do that for them to try to find the lowest cost solution possible.
Yeah. And I think that I would add to that. No recruitment process is ever perfect. But we're trying to find a process where we are getting to talk with a group that is much, much more representative of the people that you normally see. Councils normally see people who are passionate or directly affected or have some reason to be involved. This process is just trying to get out to a wider group, a more representative group of your constituents. We are experimenting with a few other things because cost. I mean, this cost is big, and it's one of the biggest issues around deliberation. We're doing a process at the moment that has a lot of wider engagement in it, standard engagement, and everyone who is involved in that, we're going to give them the opportunity to come to a sense-making day. And we're hoping that a lot of them will choose to come to that sense-making day. You know, we've collected the big wish list. What are we going to do with it? And we're hoping for a lot of people who will want to do that. And from that group, we will randomly select, and to the best of our ability, stratify a group of, say, 20 people out of perhaps the 300 that were involved in the standard engagement activities. Now that has very little cost involved with it because they've already answered a survey or come to a standard sort of workshop. So I think there are some experimental things here, and we've got to keep doing it to try and find very cost-effective ways to do this. But there's pros and cons of all of it, as Brett was just saying.
Thank you for the question, Gay. Councillor Prue Cutts of Whitehorse, are you with us? And are you able to ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you very much. Look, my question is with regards to the recruitment, Brett. And at Whitehorse, here, east of Melbourne, we've got a very large non-English speaking background community, and about, I think, other councillors on here from Whitehorse, but I think we're something like 38% are born overseas. And we've got a large Chinese, Indian. So when we're sending out letters, unless they're in their language that these people can understand, how can we get them on board? And also not only getting them at that recruitment stage, but also at the next stage in groups, talking about what their issues are when they perhaps can't understand English. So I think these are some of the questions I'd be very interested in exploring. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, Prue. We did the recruitment in Wales where there's a substantial minority who speak Welsh over English, etc. what we did, of course, we sent out a multilingual information pack. So if you have the resources to do that, so we had, one side was English, you flip the invitation card over, there's Welsh, or of course you could put other languages as well. It's relatively, then we had the registration page was in multiple languages, etc. And then in the actual, so then you could do that. At the second step stratification, you can set targets. And if you would expect that you would have under a low response rate from those communities, we just set the target, which essentially means that in the second step, they're more likely to be selected. And they are randomly selected, but they're still, you will try to hit those targets. In terms of the process, that's a whole different kettle of fish and quite a challenge. In the processes I've seen, they, for example, had a table of Welsh people to deliberate amongst themselves, and then, because of course the whole point of the deliberation is that you get these people to mix and match, but what you can do is try to mix and match in a clever way to make sure that when you mix these people at different tables, you have a translator on that table. Depending on how many languages there are, of course, this is just going to be, again, a logistical and cost exercise, quite a challenge, I agree. But we can, the important point from our perspective is we can set targets. If you can get a multilingual invitation process out there, we can set up multilingual registration pages, etc. And yeah, for the recruitment, it's all possible. Again, cost, budget, etc.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you for the question. Now, I've got about 3 or 4 in the queue. We can probably take 1 or 2 more, so if you can please pop your question in the chat window. I'm going to call on Kathleen van der Weerden. Kathleen, you have a question.
Hi, I'm Kathleen from Frankston City Council. And Brett, I'm interested to know, with the standing assemblies you talked about, so the ones that run longer term, say for 6 to 12 months, that might meet up once a month to deliberate on a certain issue, how do local lobby groups and activist groups interact with these people who they know that, that the issues are, these people are going to be part of the decision-making process? Is there any interaction or, specific discussions from lobby groups to the people in the community panels, not just the one-off convened ones? So that's my question.
So of course, individual privacy is really important here. I mean, we see these panels in Toronto, for example. They have a standing panel that advises the city council on transport issues, etc. There's now a standing panel in east of Belgium. Actually, they've set up a permanent standing panel there. There's a bit of discussion I'm aware of standing panels in Australia as well. So the worry is, of course, that this group of people will become institutionalized in the sense and, a target of lobbyist vested interests. We haven't seen that in the past, of course, obviously, because they're still only advisory in the end. That hasn't happened, but after that, then that's the crucial element of having a time limit on it. So these people would potentially meet, say, 10 times a year, and that would be it. They would then be rotated through and replaced. If you want a bit of continuity in that standing panel at the same time as reducing this potential of them becoming institutionalized, so to speak, then you would replace half every 6 months. So there's a bit of overlap. There'll be new people, old people. So if it was a standing panel of 30, 15 people would step down every 6 months, and you would just select another 15 people to be the exact demographic match of the 15 who have left. So it continues to be a representative sample of the community. I mean, stakeholder and other invested interest engagement in these panels is a whole different process. And I think any good engagement process, of course, will engage all the stakeholders and give them a platform to have their say. And that's part of the information step in the deliberation. They get to have their say, but they don't have any power, specific power, other than the power of trying to influence people with their opinions, etc. But I mean, all good. Maybe Kimbra can say more about.
I can add to that a little bit, because we deal with that all the time about how are we going to deal with the stakeholder groups. There is those aspects Brett's been talking about. how do we stop them being lobbied? But in terms of stakeholder and interest groups, we do have to involve them in some way. And so what we typically do would that we provide a briefing for them very early in the process so they know exactly what's happening and how they can be involved. We would often, on high profile ones, invite the various interest groups to nominate speakers. Who do they think the panel should hear from? I mean, clearly they can't hear from everyone, but we'd have a process where interest groups could nominate people who they think the panel should hear from, and so they become part of the experts that speak to the panel. And we always encourage them to observe the process so that they can see that it's been fair and transparent.
Thank you for the question, Kathleen. Councillor Amanda Stone of Yarra, you have a question?
Hi. It was a question that arose from the first principle that Kimbra referred to about influence and how councils really need to commit to implementing the recommendations or as close as they can from the panel. Sometimes you might consult on issues or have a deliberative process on issues that take longer than you anticipated to actually put into practice. And that might have an impact on how effective a process is experienced as. So I wondered if you had any recommendations about the length of time, the maximum or the ideal length of time that you can have before it's experienced as not actually having an influence. Is it 1 year, 2 years, 6 months?
It's a really good question because I don't, have a specific answer for you about the number of years, but I think it's a really important part of the process. And we've talked with some academics in the field around this too. It's that we don't lose touch once we're in the implementation stage. And that I think this is a thing around communication, to communicate back to the panel, at fairly regular intervals about what has happened with their recommendations. So, perhaps at 6 months you haven't been able to do too much, but you'll be able to report back at 12 months about what's been done. So I think it's about regular ongoing communication, because one of the most interesting ones at the moment is the panel, the citizens jury that sat on what should happen at Geelong, whether when the Geelong Council was dismissed. One of their recommendations was that there should be compulsory training for councillors, for candidates going into elections. And look, we've, I can't remember how many years ago Geelong was now, perhaps 3 or 4, but it's happening right now. That panel, clearly a few other people had a bit of a say about what was going to happen, but they were really part of that process. And in fact, it's been on my mind, we should be writing back to everyone on that Geelong panel right now to remind them that, part of the influence that they've had in this process.
If I could just add one tiny bit, I think one of the key parts of these deliberative principles is, deliberation means reason giving, means, and it's part of that is connecting the council to the deliberative mini public and making sure that there is a step there where they say not only what they've done, but why. Okay, we couldn't quite do that because of budgetary constraints, or we could do that because of this, we're planning on doing this. So the whole process of reason giving and explanation should also be in place in the connection between the council and the public post the event.
Thank you. Conscious of time, we've still got a few questions. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can before 4 o'clock. Leanne Robb, are you there?
Hi there, sorry about that. I don't have the camera working at the moment, but just managed to unmute myself. Yeah, look, my question was just out of curiosity actually around doing your sense-making day and what the process you were going to do, in light of the current restrictions and self-distancing. Yeah, how are you planning to do that?
We're planning to do it online.
Yeah.
Exactly like we're doing here right now.
Right now, yeah.
So we've been, some councils had a bit of downtime as soon as COVID hit, but we're finding that most councils now feel that it's really important to be back out there engaging the community, and that just means we have to do it online. And we have a lot of experience, as other facilitators do, around bringing people to, into online forums, using Zoom, because that allows us to put people into breakout rooms and have small group conversations. So we're finding it's very doable in online platforms.
How do you target those that aren't as IT savvy, or the members of your community who actually aren't online?
Well, it's interesting. I think there may well be some of those people. What has been surprising us, though, is the number of people who are online and who are very happy to be online if you give them a bit of support. We've taken a community panel on the Bayside Vision online. They had their first day face-to-face, so they came onto a panel thinking it was a face-to-face panel. We then needed to move it online for their second and third days. We worked with, people on our staff. There were a couple of people that didn't have any experience in getting online. We worked with them, we talked them through, and no one dropped off of that panel because of the online situation. They all learnt the technology to enable themselves to do it. I think there might be some cases where you might have the odd person that you might want to bring into a council office and help them be online in a council office. And I think our experience is that we are getting people in general community engagement, not in this deliberative process, in general community engagement, we're getting all sorts of people turning up to sessions that in the past might have been harder to get to because they live in remote areas, and they're very used to getting online and being there.
Brett, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just to report back to the experience in the UK as well. So the final weekend of the UK Climate Assembly also shifted online because of COVID. That was 110 people who were meant to meet for a whole weekend. They had already met for 3 weekends beforehand, so there was already quite a commitment to the process. But they successfully moved everyone online, and that required just a bit of one-on-one support for a small minority of those people, and just a bit of training and, all that kind of stuff. But it's all possible, all doable.
Thanks, Brett. And that's dealt with a couple of the other questions that were coming through. There's a few comments in the chat window that I recommend people have a look at if you'd like a bit further information. Some of our attendees today are obviously experienced engagement practitioners as well, so it's great to hear those perspectives. I'm going to call on one last question from Councillor Kokoczynski from Hepburn. Hello.
So good afternoon, everybody. This is very interesting. I had 2 questions. One was about rural communities and engaging quite diverse communities there, like, town folk and farmers. And also various subgroups under that. The second question really related to about overcoming this whole issue about, well, isn't this what we're elected to do as councillors? And how do you get over the resistance of councillors who say, well, we were elected, this is our job, this is our deliberative practice, we'll bring in a few people to bounce around ideas, but in the end we have to, this is our job. So how do you kind of overcome that resistance?
The rural folk one and the town folk one, I'm not quite sure of the intent of that question, though someone did say to me, why do we expect that rural people can't do this online work when most of us are farmers sitting on tractors who are very computer orientated? But perhaps the question's something else.
Yeah, it was very much something else. Yeah, because sometimes in some towns, depending on where they're at, there can be a bit of tension between the farming community and people who live in the towns, and particularly peri-urban towns where you have an influx of, people would call them blow-ins.
I think
that sort of thing. That's
every engagement process has people with very diverse views. We're dealing, yours is about, perhaps farmers and towns. In coastal towns, it's about people who want to walk their dogs on the beach and those that don't. There are so many issues. It's, that's about the process, about how do you bring people together to have good conversations. And we, please, always happy to talk to you about facilitation and how we get people together to have good conversations. But I think this issue about councillors is a really important one. Because they are elected to make decisions, and at the end of the day, they will still be making decisions. deliberation doesn't take that decision-making power away from councillors. What it's trying to do is give councillors and councils a much better sense of what their community thinks is a sensible way to move forward on an issue. So we see it as adding quality information that will help decisions get made, particularly on complex, difficult issues that have been stuck and, you know, no progress has been made. But as to how you get people to believe that is a much more difficult issue. And my only way is to see it, to believe it. I think you've just got to see a deliberation in action to see how it happens and to get that respect. That, you know, any deliberation just leads to this enormous amount of respect between the community and the council. They see that each other, you know, the councillors see that this is a really reasonable group of people that are really working hard on behalf of their community. And the community people see that councillors have to make some really tough decisions, and they really have their eyes opened about what it's like to make those tough decisions for councils.
Kimbra, we're starting to lose people to other commitments. Just perhaps a very quick final question from Bernadine. I'll ask it for you, Bernadine, if you don't mind, for time reasons. Is there a danger through this that you might achieve the most popular decision rather than the best decision?
Good. You want to start on that one, Brett, quickly?
I think that's what it gets back to, this public judgment, which to me is like the opposite of public opinion. So it's not that you're just sending out a survey and people are ticking the most popular option, which is often one that's unrealistic or is on this sort of wish list, so to speak. But once you go through this good process of informed deliberation, to me, that is the best, whatever that means, because you are coming to this public judgment essentially, and it's very different to an opinion survey, an opinion poll, and that's what I think is what defines it as deliberative.
Terrific, thank you. We're going to have to call it quits there. Thank you very much, everyone, for your participation. Can I pass on an apology from Catherine Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, who wasn't able to join us due to a ministerial council meeting on women's equality. Very important work that needs to go on as well. So that leaves me to say thank you to Brett Hennig from the Sortition Foundation, particularly Brett, for getting up so early there in Budapest and joining us with your insights. We can let you go and have some breakfast now, perhaps. And thank you, it's been great to meet you. Kimbra White, co-founder of MosaicLab. Thank you, Kimbra. And as you mentioned, that short guide for councils is being provided to all councils in Victoria free of charge. The link is in the chat window, but it will also be in the materials that the VLGA sends out to all our participants today, along with the slides. So please, a virtual round of applause for Brett and Kimbra for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. It's been much appreciated. Thank you. Terrific. And thank you to all of you for participating. Lovely comments coming through the chat window, so thank you. This program will be uploaded as an episode of VLGA Connect very soon via the VLGA's YouTube channel. So look out for that. If you missed part of it, you can relive it. If you know someone who might have enjoyed the session but wasn't able to join us, they'll be able to watch it back. So thank you all for being with us, and we look forward to having your company again soon for more of these types of sessions from the VLGA. Good afternoon to you.